A young woman, dressed in a torn wedding dress, stands in the pouring rain. The white lace clings to her skin, streaked with mud and tears. Her trembling hands clutch the fabric near her chest, as if holding on to the last shred of dignity she has left. Her lips quiver as she whispers into the night. How did it come to this? She is only 22, but her eyes already carry the weight of decades of sorrow. The street behind her is empty, silent, except for the sound of water dripping from the lamppost above. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks, but here, in this lonely moment, it feels as though the world has abandoned her. She was meant to be celebrating love, surrounded by family, dancing to music that filled the air with joy. Instead, she stands here, betrayed, broken, and bound by a secret she never saw coming. Why was she forced to marry a man who barely had enough money to feed himself, let alone build a family with her? What truth was he hiding that no one dared to speak about? Was he protecting her from something? Or was he hiding behind lies that would eventually destroy them both? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Emily, though most of the town only ever referred to her as the orphan girl. She lost both her parents before she even turned 12, and from that moment on, the world seemed to close its doors on her. Her relatives took her in, but not out of love, out of obligation. She became the forgotten shadow in their household, always serving, always cleaning, never belonging. The inheritance her parents left behind vanished into the pockets of greedy uncles and aunts, leaving Emily with nothing to her name but the faded photographs she hid under her pillow. Day after day, she wondered if she would ever escape the silent cruelty of those walls, the whispered insults at family dinners, the way they made her feel invisible. For Emily, marriage wasn't about love. It was about survival. But what happens when survival feels no different from captivity? The man she married was Daniel, a name spoken often in mockery among the villagers. He was poor, humble, the kind of man who worked sunup to sundown with his bare hands, yet never seemed to have enough to show for it. His shirts were always worn thin, patched at the elbows, and his shoes carried the scars of too many miles, walked in search of day labor. When he walked through the marketplace, people laughed under their breath. That's who she ended up with? An orphan girl married to a beggar boy, they'd sneer. And still, Emily chose him, or rather was pushed toward him. To the outside world, their union looked like the joining of two broken souls clinging to each other for survival. But what the villagers didn't know was that Daniel wasn't who he appeared to be. Beneath his silence, beneath his poverty, was a truth that would one day shake them all. Emily never wanted this marriage. On the day her relatives told her it was settled, she cried until her eyes turned red. "Please," she begged her aunt, her voice breaking. "I don't love him. I don't even know him." But her words carried no weight in that house. They silenced her with sharp tones, reminding her of her place, reminding her that she had no right to choose. In their eyes, Emily was a burden, a mouth to feed, a stain on the family's name. And so, without her consent, the wedding was arranged. On that cold morning, she walked down the aisle with trembling steps, her heart pounding with dread. She was not walking toward freedom. She was walking toward a prison built not of stone, but of expectations and chains she never asked to wear. Yet Daniel, the man she was forced to marry, was not the monster she expected. On their first night together, when she sat quietly in a corner, bracing herself for cruelty. He only asked if she was hungry. He gave her space, treated her with a quiet respect she had never known under her relative's roof. When she spilled water on the floor by accident, he did not shout. He knelt and cleaned it himself. When she burned the bread one evening, he simply smiled and said, "It still tastes better than what I could ever cook." His gentleness was unsettling. Emily had grown used to sharp words, to mocking laughter, to a life where she was always less than others. Daniel was different, too different. She began to wonder, was his kindness real, or was it the mask of a man hiding something deeper? As weeks turned into months, the tension grew inside her. Villagers continued to mock their marriage, whispering behind their backs, laughing at their poverty. Emily endured it silently, but at night, when Daniel's back was turned, she studied him. The way he avoided certain questions about his past, the way he left home before dawn and returned late without explanation. She wanted to trust him, perhaps even love him, but the silence around him was louder than words. One evening, she noticed how he quickly shoved a small worn-out box into his drawer when he thought she wasn't looking. Her heart raced. What could a man like him possibly be hiding that he guarded so carefully? And then, one night, when the house was still and Daniel was asleep, Emily slowly opened that drawer. Inside, she found something that would change everything. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid of the small box. At first, she expected to see nothing more than scraps of paper or perhaps an old photograph. But inside, she found documents she could barely understand. Business papers stamped with signatures and official seals, accounts with numbers too large for her to even imagine. Beneath the papers lay a small leather wallet, and inside it, a bank card with a balance that made her eyes widen in disbelief. And at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a gold watch, its surface gleaming faintly even in the dim candlelight. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was not the life of a poor laborer. This was the evidence of a man with wealth, power, and secrets. And yet every day, Daniel lived as if he owned nothing. He patched his shoes, ate scraps, and worked with blistered hands. Why? The next morning, Emily studied him carefully. Daniel tied his worn boots, adjusted his patched shirt, and kissed her forehead before heading out for work, as though nothing had changed. He never mentioned the papers, never hinted at the wealth she now knew he kept hidden. At dinner, when she placed a thin soup on the table, he smiled and said, "This is perfect." She wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but the words stayed trapped in her chest. Why would a rich man pretend to be poor? Was he hiding from someone? Was it a test, a punishment, or something even darker? Every glance, every smile, every silence now carried weight she could no longer ignore. The mystery of her husband deepened, pulling her into a world she never asked to enter. If you've ever had to hide a secret to protect yourself, type "I'm still here" in the comments. Let's see who's still watching. The whispers from her family never stopped. Whenever Emily visited, her cousins would smirk, her uncles would shake their heads, and her aunts would sigh dramatically, as if her life had turned into a cautionary tale. "Married to a nobody," they would sneer, loud enough for her to hear. She traded her future for scraps. They mocked her dress, her small home, her husband's calloused hands. One evening, during a family gathering, Daniel himself overheard. He stood quietly in the doorway, carrying a basket of bread he had worked all day to buy. The insults pierced the air, but he said nothing. He only set the bread on the table, offered a polite nod, and left with calm dignity. Emily's heart twisted. She wanted to defend him, to scream at her relatives, but fear of drawing their wrath kept her silent. Yet inside her, a storm began to build. At home, Emily lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, torn apart by questions. Should she confront Daniel about the wealth she discovered? Should she expose his secret, force him to reveal who he really was? Or would that destroy whatever fragile piece they had built together? Her thoughts were interrupted by something she could no longer ignore. Mysterious phone calls Daniel took late at night. The moment the telephone rang, he would step outside, speaking in low tones she could never fully hear. His words were hurried, deliberate, and always ended with a long pause before he returned, his face unreadable. Each time, Emily pretended to sleep, though her heart pounded in her chest. The man who worked with blistered hands and patched shoes suddenly seemed like a stranger in her own home. What was he hiding? Who was calling at those late hours? The tension between them grew heavier with every passing day. Emily's relatives continued to mock, the villagers continued to laugh, and still Daniel lived in silence. She found herself watching his every move, his lingering glances at the locked drawer, the way his hands sometimes trembled after a phone call, the nights he returned later than usual. It was as if two men existed inside one body, the humble laborer the world saw and the man of secrets she had glimpsed only once. Emily's fear began to mix with suspicion. Was she married to someone dangerous, or someone running from danger? Every day, she edged closer to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to know. And then, one day, black cars arrived at their doorstep. When the black cars stopped outside their small, crumbling home, Emily froze. The engines cut off in unison, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any insult she had ever endured. Men stepped out. Sharp suits, polished shoes, faces stern with authority. They did not look like villagers nor laborers nor anyone from the life Emily knew. And then, before she could gather her breath, they bowed. Each one of them lowered their heads, and the words that spilled from their mouths turned her blood cold. "Sir," they said, addressing Daniel. "Sir." The man mocked in the market. The man her family called worthless. The man she believed was trapped in the same poverty as her. In that moment she realized he wasn't just hiding money, he was hiding power, a power that reached far beyond their small town. But Daniel's face remained calm, unchanged, as though nothing unusual had happened. The men spoke in hushed tones, handing Daniel folders she could not see inside, waiting for his approval with the kind of reverence she had never witnessed before. Yet when they left, Daniel returned to their small wooden table, rolling up his sleeves as though ready to chop wood again. No explanation, no acknowledgement. He simply carried on as the quiet, humble man she had always known. Emily's heart raced with questions she couldn't silence. If he was truly wealthy, why live in rags? If he commanded power, why pretend to be powerless? And why, out of everyone, had he chosen her? The questions circled her mind endlessly, leaving her torn between awe and fear. Was he protecting her from something too dangerous to reveal? Or was she nothing more than a pawn in a game she could not see? News travels quickly in small towns, and whispers have a way of growing louder with every retelling. Emily's relatives, who once mocked her marriage relentlessly, began to sense something had changed. The very people who called Daniel a beggar now spoke in softened tones, suddenly eager to reconnect. They invited Emily to gatherings, brought gifts wrapped in ribbons, and forced smiles that did not reach their eyes. To outsiders, it looked like reconciliation. But Emily felt the truth beneath their words. Their sudden interest was not born out of love. It was greed. She saw it in the way her uncle's eyes lingered on Daniel, in the way her cousins whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. They wanted something, and for the first time in her life, Emily held the key. Yet holding that key felt like a burden that grew heavier with every passing day. She found herself caught in an unbearable struggle. Part of her wanted to believe her relatives had changed, that they could finally accept her, that maybe she could rebuild the family she had lost. But another part of her, the part scarred by years of mistreatment, knew better. She could still hear the laughter when they called her worthless, still remember the nights she cried alone, wondering if she mattered to anyone at all. And now, with Daniel's secret shadowing their every step, she feared their sudden affection was nothing but a mask for betrayal. Fear gnawed at her in silence. What if trusting them meant losing everything she had left? The tension reached its peak when Daniel agreed to attend a family dinner. Emily's heart pounded as they walked through the doors of her relative's house, the smell of roasted meat filling the air, the clinking of glasses echoing through the room. Smiles were everywhere, but sincerity was nowhere to be found. Daniel remained composed, offering polite greetings, while Emily sat uneasily, caught between suspicion and hope. She prayed she was wrong, that perhaps her family truly wanted peace. But deep down, she knew something was coming. And what happened at that family dinner? No one expected. The dinner began with forced laughter and shallow conversation, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Emily sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching her relatives shower Daniel with compliments they would have never spoken before. "You've always been so hardworking, and we knew you'd make something of yourself tasted false, like poison hidden in honey." For a long while, Daniel remained silent, eating slowly, acknowledging their words with little more than a nod. But then, as the room grew quieter and all eyes settled on him, he set down his glass and spoke words that froze the air. Calmly, as though it were nothing at all, he said, "I am not poor. I am not what you all believed me to be. I have wealth beyond what any of you can imagine. But I chose this life because I wanted to see who truly cared." The room erupted in gasps, forks clattered against plates, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every mocking relative who once ridiculed him suddenly leaned forward in desperation. Emily's aunt, the very woman who called him a beggar, now begged forgiveness with trembling words. Her uncle, who had sneered at his patched clothes, forced a smile and said, "We only wanted the best for you." One by one, they tried to erase years of cruelty with false affection, their voices dripping with greed and fear. Emily sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her heart pounded with disbelief as the man she thought she knew, the humble worker mocked by all, revealed a truth that turned her entire world upside down. For the first time, she realized her life was built on secrets she could no longer ignore. In the days following the dinner, the tone of Emily's family shifted completely. Where there had once been insults and mocking, there was now excessive kindness. Her relatives visited unannounced, carrying baskets of fruit, speaking sweetly, insisting they only wanted to spend more time with her. But behind their smiles, Emily could feel the sharpness of their intentions. Late at night, she overheard her cousins whispering about bank accounts and property, about how much Daniel might be hiding. about how they could convince Emily to share in family responsibilities. It wasn't love. It was greed dressed in the clothing of reconciliation. And though she wanted to believe otherwise, Emily knew the truth. The same people who abandoned her as a child were now scheming to take everything from her as an adult. What she didn't know was that Daniel saw it too. Though he never confronted them, though he acted as though their visits were nothing more than family pleasantries, he quietly kept watch. He ensured Emily was never left alone with the relatives who pressed her with probing questions. He redirected conversations, shielded her from their manipulations, and at night, when she couldn't sleep, he sat silently by her side, as though he knew the weight pressing on her chest. Yet he never admitted the extent of what he knew. To Emily, it seemed as though he ignored the signs. But in truth, every move he made was a quiet act of protection. Still, tension grew inside her. If her family could betray her so easily, who could she trust? Her relatives plotted with greed, her husband hid behind silence, and Emily felt caught between two worlds she could not fully understand. Every day the walls seemed to close in tighter. Every word of kindness from her family sounded like another chain wrapping around her neck. And then, when she least expected it, the greatest betrayal of all arrived, not from her greedy uncles, not from her mocking aunts, not even from the cousins who whispered late at night. The betrayal came from someone she trusted most. The betrayal revealed itself in the cruelest way. One evening, as Emily passed by the back of her uncle's house, she heard voices she recognized. Her heart stopped when she realized it was her cousin, the one who once cried with her through lonely nights, the only person she thought understood her pain. But now, that same cousin whispered to strangers, outsiders whose accents and tones she did not know. "It won't be difficult," her cousin said. "He trusts me. If we can separate them, you'll have your chance." Emily's breath shook as the words sank in. They weren't plotting against her. They were plotting to kidnap her husband. The man everyone called worthless was now the target of greed so ruthless it came from her own blood. She staggered back from the window, tears streaming, rage boiling inside her chest. The only person she trusted had become her enemy. That night, everything came crashing down. Emily confronted her cousin, her voice breaking with fury and grief. "How could you? After everything, we were supposed to be family." The room erupted into chaos, relatives shouting, accusations flying, Emily sobbing uncontrollably. But in the middle of it all, Daniel finally stepped forward. His voice was calm, but his presence filled the room like a storm breaking open. For years he had lived quietly, humbly, but now there was no need to hide. He revealed the truth, the papers, the wealth, the empire that stretched across businesses and lands far beyond their village. He confessed that he had hidden it all, not out of shame, but out of necessity. He wanted to know who would stand by him when he had nothing. He wanted to protect Emily from the vultures he knew would circle the moment his fortune was revealed. And now, that moment had arrived. As the shouting of her relatives faded into silence, Daniel turned to Emily. His eyes, calm yet steady, met hers with a truth she could no longer deny. "I never needed someone to admire my wealth," he said gently. "I only needed someone to see me for who I am." In that moment, the years of doubt, the hidden fears, the unanswered questions melted away. He had chosen humility not as punishment, but as a test of love, and she had unknowingly passed it. Around them, her relatives stood exposed, their greed plain for all to see. No apologies could erase the cruelty they had shown her. No tears could undo the betrayal. They were left behind, chasing shadows of fortune they would never touch. For the first time in her life, Emily felt dignity. She was no longer the orphan mocked and silenced. She was a woman respected, protected, and loved, something she had longed for since childhood. Though her path had been painful, it had led her here, to a place where she finally belonged. And as she looked at Daniel, she understood the strange journey her life had taken. Sometimes, the poorest choice can lead to the richest destiny. If this story touched you, hit like. It helps us reach more people. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories every week. What would you have done if you were in her place? Tell us below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.